She was 20 years old the morning her uncle left her on the high prairie. Standing alone on a swell of grass in Dakota Territory, with the wind pulling at her skirts, and the whole indifferent sky pressing down on her shoulders. From high above, she would have been nothing more than a dark speck against an ocean of pale green. One small figure in a country so wide it swallowed sound. Closer, you would have seen the set of her shoulders, the worn leather satchel at her hip, the way she did not run after the shrinking canvas tops. She only watched them go. Closer still, you would have seen her hands, chapped, steady, folded around a small wooden horse and a rectangle of gray slate. The last things a dead grandfather had ever placed in them. What no one saw, what the land itself had kept hidden, through the long seasons of drought and snow, was a wooden box buried beneath a collapsed dugout. A half-day's walk to the north, a box that held a name, fortune, and the truth about the family she thought she had lost. By nightfall, a September blizzard would drive her to a ruin no one had entered in 20 years. By morning, her hand would find the stone that answered hollow. Settle in close and let us tell you her story. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Her name was Ada Brennan. To understand what she carried with her that morning and what she did not, you have to go back. Back before the wagons, before the Missouri, before her uncle Ansel Doyle had ever spoken the lie about a cracked axle. All the way back to a plain frame house in eastern Iowa in the spring of 1865, when the country was still bleeding out from the war, and a schoolteacher and a seamstress named their infant daughter Ada Margaret Brennan, and looked at each other across the cradle, as if they had done something ordinary. That was also the only miracle either of them would ever require. They were quiet people, kind, not rich. Her father read to her every night, from the Book of Ruth. Her mother could turn a torn dress into a christening gown in a single afternoon. They loved her the way plain people love, without announcement, and Ada had time to know that love for exactly 6 years before the fever moved through the county in the autumn of 1871, and took them both inside a single week. She did not remember much of it. She remembered the smell of camphor, the doctor's boots on the porch, her mother's hand going cold in hers, not all at once, but by degrees, the way a stove goes cold when no one has fed it. She remembered the silence that came after. That was the thing she remembered most clearly. The house did not sound the same. The rooms held their breath. And into that silence, a week after the funeral, her grandfather came for her. His name was Silas Brennan. He was her father's father. He had crossed the Atlantic from County Cork as a boy of 9 on a ship that had lost 40 passengers to the crossing, and he had learned his stonework in the quarries of Pennsylvania before he came west to Iowa in his middle age, and he did not speak much in any language. He was a big man gone lean with age, forearms corded like old rope, thumbs so thick they seemed carved from the same oak he shaped, hair the color of iron shavings, eyes that had seen enough to be careful about what they let past them. He came into the house where his son and daughter-in-law had died, and he stood along, while in the front room without moving. Then he crossed to the child sitting on the settee in her funeral dress, and he crouched down, so their eyes were level. He did not tell her he was sorry. He did not tell her it would be all right. He said in his low, patient voice, "You are coming home with me." That was all. She reached up. He took her hand, and she went. For the next 12 years, she lived with him in a stone and frame house on the edge of a small town, with a workshop behind it, where he mended chairs and broken yokes and doors that no longer hung true. The town called him the Irishman. They meant it kindly. He answered to it because he had heard worse names in Pennsylvania. He did not know how to comfort a grieving child with words, so he taught her the world with his hands instead. The week after he brought her home, he set a block of soft pine on the kitchen table. Beside it he laid a small whittling knife with a bone handle. He drew up a stool for her. He drew up another for himself. And he closed his rough calloused hand over her smaller one and guided the blade in the first shy cut. The pine curled away in a long pale ribbon. Ada watched it fall. She was 6 years old, and she did not know she had just been handed the thing that would keep her alive. By the end of that first winter, she could carve the rounded shape of a horse. Not a running horse, not a rearing horse, a standing horse, head cocked, one front hoof raised, as if listening for something in the wind. It was her grandfather's own design, and he had learned it from his own father, and his father had learned it from a woodcarver in a village in Cork that no longer existed by the time Ada was born. The horse was small enough to fit in a child's palm. Silas kept the first one she ever finished on the sill above his workbench. He kept it there until the day he died. He taught her the way a man teaches, when he suspects he will not always be there to explain things twice. He taught her to read a board before she cut it, to find the grain and follow it rather than fight it. He taught her the names of trees by their bark, the temper of steel by its color. He taught her to set stone, to read a wall for its weak seam, to choose a rock the way a mother chooses a name, with attention to what it would have to bear. Above all, he taught her to keep her tools sharp. "Keep a keen edge, girl," he told her, his palm warm over her fingers as she worked the small gray slate. "On your blade, and on your judgment, because a dull mind cuts crooked, same as a dull knife." He said it to her more times than she could count. She grew up thinking it was a proverb about knives. It would take a September morning on the high prairie for her to understand it had never been about knives at all. The homestead they shared was never prosperous. Silas took work as it came. Some months he did well. Some months he ate beans and gave Ada the meat. Ada learned early to mend her own clothes, to grow what could be grown in the small patch of yard behind the house, to make coffee stretch and flower stretch and hope stretch. She learned the satisfaction of handing back a chair that had wobbled for a decade and now sat true. She learned that broken things were only broken until someone took the time to see them. "The world is full of good things folks throw away," Silas told her once, running his thumb along a joint she had mended in a customer's rocker. "On account of they haven't got the patience to see what's still sound in them." It was the closest thing to a philosophy he ever gave her. It would prove in the years to come to be the truest map she owned. He died in the deep cold of February 1883. Ada was 17. He went in his sleep, the way a spent candle simply gives up its flame. She found him in the morning when the fire had gone out and the house was cold, and she went into his room to tell him she would build it back up. He looked as though he had only just closed his eyes. She sat with him a long time before she went for the neighbor. She did not weep then. She had learned by that age that weeping changed nothing a person could not change with their own two hands. She buried him beside her parents in the small churchyard on the edge of town. The ground was frozen, so hard the men had to build a fire on it the day before to soften it enough to dig. She stood at the grave in a wool coat that had already been mended twice, and she understood, in a way she had never understood before, that there was no one left in the world whose duty it was to keep her. The workshop and the house went to pay the debts he had never mentioned. By the time the ground thawed in April, she owned exactly what she could carry. A chest of his tools, a bundle of clothes, a family Bible with 4 generations of Brennans written in it, the wooden horse, the slate he had worn to a saddle by 50 years of keeping edges true, and her hands, and the things her hands knew. Her only living kin were her mother's brother and his wife. His name was Ansel Doyle. Her name was Rhoda. They kept a struggling farm 2 counties west, near a town called Hollis Bend, and they took Ada in that spring of 1883. It would be unfair to call them cruel. Cruelty at least requires a kind of attention. Ansel and Rhoda Doyle were simply tired people, already stretched past their means, already carrying more than the farm could bear. And when they looked at Ada Brennan, they did not see a young woman who could mend a door in an afternoon and coax a garden out of thin soil and calculate the pitch of a roof in her head. They saw one more mouth at their table, one more body in a house that had no spare corner. She earned her keep and then some. She mended what Rhoda could not. She rehung the barn door that had hung wrong for 6 years. She fixed the pump at the well. She built a chicken coop with her own hands out of scrap lumber and old nails she had straightened one by one on a stone. She kept the garden. She sheared the sheep. She butchered the hog when the season came. None of it changed the way their eyes slid past her. The way a person looks past a piece of furniture they have decided to sell. 2 years passed like that. She was 17 when she came. She turned 18. She turned 19. She turned 20 in the spring of 1885, and no one at the Doyle farm remembered her birthday, and she did not mention it, because she had learned by then not to ask people for what they had already decided not to give. Then, in July of that year, Ansel came in from town with news. He had sold the farm. He had bought passage in a wagon company bound for the Willamette Valley in Oregon. He stood in the kitchen, with his hat in his hands, and spoke grandly of black soil, and mild winters, and a fresh start scoured clean of old failures. He did not once look at Ada as he said it. He did not say her name. He did not say what she would do, or where she would go, or what place she held in the shape of this new life. He did not speak of her at all. And in that omission Ada read the whole of his intention. She was part of the old life he meant to shed. And a man determined to be reborn does not carry his dead weight across the mountains. She could have refused to go. She could have asked a neighbor to take her in as a hired girl. She could have written to the church in Iowa and begged a bed in the widow's cottage. She could have stayed behind in Hollis Bend and taken in mending and slept in a room over the livery until she had saved enough to make her own way. She thought about it for one long night. But she was 20 years old, and she had never been more than 50 miles from where she was born, and something in her, some small stubborn ember her grandfather had lit and never let go out, wanted to see the country, wanted to see what a person could make of themselves in a place where nobody yet knew what shape they had been assigned to. She would go west with the wagons. She would not go as her uncle's charity case. She spent 3 weeks of that summer trading her small store of savings and her grandfather's less essential tools for a used Prairie schooner. It was an old wagon, but a sound one. She checked every peg herself. She greased every hub. She patched the canvas where it had thinned. She bought a patient span of oxen from a farmer who was quitting the country, and she named them Job and Boaz, out of the book of Ruth her father had read to her, and she meant to drive her own wagon the whole of the way to Oregon. She would owe her uncle nothing. She would sit at his fire in the evenings only, because the arithmetic of the trail demanded it. Ansel had not expected her to have her own wagon. Something moved in his face the day she drove it up to the barn. Something small and dark and shamed. He had planned, perhaps, to have her ride in the back of his own schooner, as a poor relation on sufferance. To have her feel every mile as a favor she could not repay. Her wagon disarranged that. Her wagon made her, for the first time in 2 years, not his dependent but his neighbor. He did not thank her for it. He did not congratulate her. He only looked at the wagon a long moment and said, "That'll do, I suppose." Then he walked away. The company left Hollis Bend on the second Monday of August 1885. 41 wagons. 217 souls. A wagon master named Colonel Peyton Caldwell, who had made the crossing 3 times before and who charged each family $15 for the guidance of his experience. Ada drove Job and Boaz at the tail of the company. She had asked to drive in the middle where the dust was worse but the danger was less, and Caldwell had looked her up and down and put her at the tail without an explanation, and she had understood without needing one. A young woman driving her own wagon at the tail was a young woman easier to lose than a young woman driving in the middle. She said nothing. She drove. The country changed as they crossed it. The soft green hills of Iowa gave way to the rougher grass of Nebraska. The trees grew scarce. The sky grew larger than any sky she had ever stood under. Wind became a constant. The nights came down cold even in the tail of August, and folks began to speak of the mountain passes ahead, and the snow that would close them, if the company did not make good time. That talk sharpened everyone. It turned neighbor against neighbor, over grazing and pace, and the endless arithmetic of who was slowing whom. Ada kept to herself. She tended her wagon better than she tended herself. She greased her own hubs. She checked her own timbers by lantern light, while the camp slept. Because Silas had taught her, that a wagon neglected on the plains was a grave dug in advance. She knew that wagon the way she knew her own hands. She could have named every peg in it. Which is why, on the gray morning of September the 22nd, when the frost lay thick on the canvas, and her breath smoked in the still air, she knew her uncle was lying the moment the words left his mouth. He came to her wagon, before the company was fully awake. He would not meet her eyes. He kicked at the rear axle with the toe of his boot, cleared his throat, kicked again. "Ada," he said, "this axle. What about it? It's cracked. Near to failing." "No, it isn't." She said it flatly, without heat, the way you tell a child there is no monster under the bed. She crouched in the frozen sod, and ran her palm along the length of the axle, and felt what she already knew, which was that the wood was whole. She could feel that it was whole, feel it the way she could feel a false note in a floor, before her weight was fully on it. There was not a crack in that timber a knife's edge deep. She looked up at her uncle's face, at the muscle working in his jaw, at his gaze fixed hard on the pale line of the western horizon he was so desperate to reach. And she understood. She understood the way a person understands a long sum they have been adding in their head for years, and only now sees the total of. The axle had nothing to do with any of it. The judgment had been passed somewhere back in Iowa. Maybe back in the kitchen the day he had told her about Oregon. Maybe further back than that. Maybe the day her mother had died, and left him a niece he had never wanted. She was the weight to be shed. He had only been waiting for a place empty enough that no one would remember it. She rose slowly, dusted her knees. She looked her uncle in the face. He would not look back. "Ansel," she said, her voice level and quiet as still water. "That axle's as sound as the day it was cut, and you know it." The color rose in his neck. He had come prepared to be argued with. He had come prepared, perhaps, to be wept at and forgiven. Her calm refusal to grant him either left him with nothing to stand on. "There's a party of freighters," he mumbled. "A day back on the trail. They'll pick you up." "Is there?" "Caldwell said so. Caldwell said so." He nodded. He would not look at her. "I'm leaving you provisions," he said. He set a canvas sack down between them the way a man sets down a coin for a beggar. "It's more than fair." She did not look at the sack. She looked at him. "You're leaving me on the prairie. There's freighters. You're leaving me on the prairie. Ada, say it." He said nothing. She waited. The frost crackled under her boots as she shifted her weight. Somewhere at the head of the camp a mule brayed. A child laughed. A woman scolded her in a language Ada did not recognize. The whole ordinary morning went on around them, while her uncle stood looking at the ground. "I'm leaving you provisions," he said again. "That's the fair part." She nodded once. She did not argue further. To argue would have been to beg for a decency that was not in him to give. And she had learned long ago the exact price of asking people for what they had already decided to withhold. She bent and took stock of the sack. A slab of salt bacon. A double handful of dried beans. A tin of matches. A small twist of coffee. A coil of jerked beef. 2 folded wool blankets. It was the arithmetic of a guilty man, weighing out just enough that he could call himself generous. And not 1 ounce more. He did not offer to help her unhitch. He did not offer to leave her job and Boaz, because the oxen were company property now, and both of them knew it, and she did not ask because asking would have been giving him something else to refuse her. He turned. He walked back into the waking camp. He called for his family to strike the tents and get the teams in harness. Rhoda came to the edge of the firelight once, while the wagons were forming up. She stood a moment looking at her niece. Something moved behind her eyes. Pity, maybe, or the ghost of a shame too small to act on. Her mouth opened. Whatever she meant to say died there. She pulled her shawl tighter. She turned away. She climbed up beside her husband, without a word. The wagons creaked into motion one by one. The great canvas hoods dwindled and paled against the enormous morning, until the last of them dropped below a distant rise. The sound of them was gone, absorbed into the ceaseless whisper of the wind, through a million stems of grass. She was alone, in a way she had never been alone in her life. In a country that did not know her name and would not have cared to learn it. The silence that came down was the same silence that had settled over the front room in Iowa the autumn she was 6. Only now it stretched to every edge of the visible world. She did not weep. She had learned long ago that weeping changed nothing a person could not change with her own 2 hands. She opened the sack her uncle had left and took inventory of what she owned. 2 blankets, bacon, beans, matches, coffee, jerky, a satchel with the slate and the wooden horse and the folded family Bible. The wool coat that had been good 10 years ago, the clothes on her back, her hands, the things her hands knew. It was not much. It was, she told herself, enough to begin with. Because beginnings had never in her life been given to her whole. The party of freighters her uncle had promised did not exist. Or if it existed, it was so far back on the trail as to be a rumor. And Ada Brennan was not a woman to stake her life on the word of a man who had just betrayed it. She would not sit in the cold grass and wait to be rescued by a stranger who might be 100 miles distant. She looked at the land instead. She read it the way Silas had taught her to read a plank of wood. Not for what was pretty, for what was useful. Somewhere down the slope of these prairie swells there would be a low place, a swale. Where the land dipped there might be water. Where there was water there was the chance of shelter and the chance of something to eat. She shouldered the sack. She looped the blankets across her body. She took her bearings from the pale disk of the climbing sun, and she began to walk. She walked north and west, away from the ruts of the trail, down into the folds of the country, where a thread of darker green traced the memory of a stream. The grass hissed against her skirts and hid the ground, so that every step was a small act of faith. More than once her boot found a rabbit hole or a shift of loose earth, and she went down to one knee and rose again, without stopping longer than it took to check she had not turned an ankle. The sun climbed, gave a thin, comfortless warmth that did nothing to touch the cold living in the wind. By midday the wind itself began to change, swinging around out of the north with a new and colder edge that raised the hair on her arms and set some old animal warning ringing at the base of her skull. She knew that smell. It was the flat mineral smell of coming weather, the smell that had preceded every hard storm of her Iowa childhood. And she quickened her pace because she understood with sudden clarity that the wind was no longer the worst thing in this country. To be caught in the open on the prairie when a September norther came down was to gamble her life against the temperature. She had been raised by a man who did not gamble. She followed the dry watercourse downward. The swale deepened around her into a proper draw, steeper sides that broke the wind at last, so she could hear her own breathing again. Ragged, quick. The sky in the north went the color of a fresh bruise. The temperature fell, so fast she could feel it moving through her coat like water finding cracks in a hull. Then came the first hard pellets of sleet. Not soft snow, frozen shot that bounced off the packed earth and stung her cheeks and the backs of her hands. Behind the sleet came the true wind, a howling wall of it that flattened the grass and drove the ice sideways until the world beyond a few dozen feet dissolved into a hissing gray murk. She pulled a blanket over her head and shoulders. She pressed on, bent nearly double, because to stop now was to freeze, and she had not survived the loss of everyone she loved to lie down and quit in a ditch. She could no longer see the sun to steer by. She steered instead by the fall of the land, keeping the draw's low line beneath her feet, letting the water's old road guide her the way it had guided her all afternoon. The cold had moved past pain into something more dangerous, a heavy syrupy warmth that whispered how easy it would be to sit and rest a while. She recognized that whisper for the lie it was. She answered it with motion, one foot, then the other, her jaw locked, her raw fingers curled into fists inside her sleeves. Person could not think their way out of that cold. They could only outlast it. Outlasting was the one thing she had done her whole life. When she saw the break in the hillside, she nearly walked past it, half blind and stumbling as she was. It was a wrongness in the smooth flank of a low rise, a dark, irregular scar, where the grass gave way to a jumble of pale, weathered fieldstones that had no business being stacked, so on a slope of packed sod and clay. Stone did not gather itself into corners. Only a person's hands did that. She stopped. She swayed in the wind. Through the streaming ice she made out the shape of it. A low mound with one side caved in. A place where the earth had been cut into and lined, and then, long ago, had partly given up and fallen back on itself. A dugout. A sod house burrowed into the south face of the rise. Its roof collapsed. Its doorway choked with fallen sod and rotted timber. Abandoned so long that the prairie had nearly finished reclaiming it. Something rose in her chest that she had not let herself feel all day. Collapse meant a hollow. A hollow meant walls. Walls meant shelter. Shelter meant she would see the morning. She half climbed, half fell up the slick shoulder of the slope toward the dark scar. The sleet driving, so thick now, that she found the entrance more by touch than by sight. Her hands closing on cold wet stone that had been set. She could feel it even through her numbness. Set by someone who understood how stone wanted to sit. The doorway was a ruin. Behind the ruin there was space. She hauled aside a length of rotted roof beam, his heart gone soft and punky. She crawled through the gap into a darkness that was all at once, blessedly out of the wind. The sudden stillness was so complete it made her ears ring. She knelt on the earthen floor, with the storm shrieking a hand's breadth above her head, and she simply breathed, her whole body shaking, the warmth of merely being sheltered flooding back into her like feeling into a sleeping limb. When her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw the place was small. Perhaps 8 feet on a side. The roof mostly gone. A great ragged hole opened to the churning sky, through which the sleet still sifted down in a fine hissing veil. But 3 of the walls stood. The back wall and the 2 sides had been built of fieldstone, unmortared, each rock chosen, and turned and fitted with its neighbors, so cunningly that 20 years of frost had failed to shrug them loose. She reached out in the dark. She laid her palm flat against the back wall, and she felt the workmanship in it the way she might have felt a familiar hand. Something in her went very still. This was not the careless piling of a homesteader in a hurry. This was the work of a person who had loved doing it well, who had read each stone the way Silas had read each board. The recognition of it steadied her more than the shelter itself. Whoever built this, she thought, knew what my grandfather knew. The floor was a chaos of fallen sod, and shattered timber, and rock that had tumbled from the broken roof line. But the corner beneath the deepest overhang of the standing wall was nearly dry. It was there she made her stand against the night. She was too spent to do much. She cleared a rough space with her hands, dragged aside the larger stones, got her blankets down onto the driest patch, gnawed a strip of jerked beef, because she knew she had to put something in her, though she had no appetite left for anything but sleep. There would be no fire. The wood was soaked. The roof was open. She had not the strength left to gather or split. She wrapped herself in both blankets in the corner. She set her back against the fitted stone. She watched the pale sleet sifting down through the ruined roof, catching what little light there was, until the shaking eased, and a bottomless exhaustion pulled her under. She dreamed that night of her grandfather. He was standing in his workshop, sun coming in through the small dusty window. He was carving a horse. Not looking up, just carving, his thick thumb steady on the blade. "Grandpa," she said in the dream. He did not look up. "Grandpa, I'm cold." He did not look up. But she saw in the dream that the horse in his hands was not one horse. It was 2 horses, standing side by side, heads cocked, one front hoof each raised as if listening. She woke to a world scoured and silent. The storm had blown itself out sometime in the small hours. When she crawled to the doorway and looked out, the sky was a hard cloudless blue. The prairie lay under a thin skin of ice that flashed and glittered in the low morning sun, until the whole country seemed made of hammered silver. The wind had fallen to a whisper. Her breath hung in the still air. She was alive. The fact of it sat strange and enormous in her chest, because there had been an hour the night before when she had not been at all sure she would be. Cold clarified a person she had found. It burned away everything that did not matter and left only the next necessary task standing plain. Her next necessary task was to stay alive past today, and past the day after that, which meant this broken hole in the rise could not remain a place she merely huddled in. It would have to become a place she could hold. She took the measure of it in the honest morning light, with her grandfather's eye. The 3 standing walls were sound, better than sound. The 4th wall and the roof were gone. If she could clear the fallen debris, if she could raise even a partial roof, if she could get a fire going and dry the place out, she might winter here, or at least survive long enough to walk out to whatever settlement lay within reach when the weather broke for good. It was a broken place. She had spent her whole life learning that broken was only another word for not yet mended. She began that morning, and she did not stop for 2 days. Because motion was warmth and warmth was survival, and because the work gave her frightened mind something to hold besides the enormity of her situation. She found a stout length of ash among the fallen timbers, one that had been protected from the wet. She used it as a lever to pry the largest of the roof beams up out of the wreckage, dragged them clear, sweating even in the cold, her breath tearing. She cleared the sod, and the shattered timber, and the loose stone from the floor, hauled it out load by load, until the packed earth showed through, dark and level. She salvaged what timber was still sound, and stacked it against the standing wall to dry. She found, at the bottom of the debris, the collapsed remains of a hearth in the corner, a ring of blackened stones, where some long-vanished occupant had cooked their meals. The sight of it moved her oddly, this small proof that a life had been lived here once, that someone had warmed their hands at this same corner, and looked out this same doorway at this same country. By the 2nd afternoon, the place had begun to answer to her. The floor was clear. The walls stood clean. She had rigged a rough half-roof over the driest corner, from the soundest of the salvaged beams, and a patchwork of the least rotted sod. Enough to keep the weather off the space where she slept. She had coaxed a small fire to life at last. From a beam she had split down to its dry heart with her grandfather's hatchet. The thin curl of smoke rising up through the open roof. The first heat and light this ruin had known in 20 years. It felt like a flag planted on ground she had claimed. She sat back on her heels in the firelight and looked at what her hands had made of the day. For the first time, since she had watched the wagons vanish, she felt something other than the cold arithmetic of survival. She felt the beginning of something. She felt absurdly at home. This place is mine now, she thought. Worthless as it is the only thing in the world that is. The discovery came on the morning of the 3rd day. It came the way most of the important things in her life had come, not as a gift handed down, but as the reward of plain patient labor. She was leveling the last uneven patch of the floor near the back wall, working a large flat slab of granite that had settled crooked into the earth, meaning to seat it flush so she would not turn an ankle on it in the dark. She set her lever under its edge. She threw her weight against it. She expected the dull resistance of stone bedded in packed soil. What she got instead stopped her cold. The slab moved too easily. When it shifted, the sound that came up from beneath it was not the gritting scrape of stone on earth. It was a low, resonant, hollow knock, the unmistakable voice of a void. She had heard that voice before. In the false floors old smugglers built into wagons. In the hidden compartments cabinet makers hid in fine chests. Every nerve in her body came awake at once. She knelt in the firelight and set her raw palms flat against the cold face of the granite and pushed. Slowly, grudgingly, the slab slid aside, to reveal not the dark dirt she had cleared everywhere else in that dugout, but the squared, deliberate edge of something a person had built into the ground on purpose. And then covered over, meaning for it to be found only by someone willing to dig. Ada Brennan did not breathe. She looked down into the hole in the earth she had opened. She saw, cradled in oiled cloth gone black, and stiff with age, the shape of a wooden box the size of a bread loaf. And she understood, in a way she had no words for yet, that her life had just been divided into before this moment, and after. She reached down. Her chapped hand closed on the box. She lifted it out into the firelight. The box was heavier than its size promised. Ada carried it to the doorway, where the morning light fell clean and unbroken across the sill. She sat on the packed earth with the box on her knees. She did not open it yet, because some part of her understood that whatever waited inside would divide her life. Before and after, she wanted to hold the last of the before a little longer. The wood was oak, sealed with beeswax so thick it had gone the color of old honey. Someone had cared enough about what was inside to seal it against 100 winters. She ran her thumb along the seam. She could feel the hand of the maker in the fit. She lifted the lid. The smell that came up was old paper. Beeswax, the faint mineral ghost of the earth that had held it. Under a folded square of oilcloth she found the things a person buries, when they mean them to outlast them. A soft leather pouch drawn tight at the neck. It shifted and clinked, with a weight she knew, before she opened it. A bundle of papers, stiff and yellowed, tied with a leather thong gone hard as wire. And resting atop the papers, wrapped by itself in a scrap of soft flannel, as though it were the most precious thing in the box. A small wooden horse. She did not breathe. She lifted the flannel away. She turned the little figure in the light. The world seemed to tilt beneath her. It was a horse, head cocked, one front hoof raised as if listening, carved in the same posture, with the same patient economy of cut, the same understanding of how to let the grain suggest a mane, as the one that sat that very moment in her satchel not 4 feet away. 2 horses, made by 2 different hands, separated by a lifetime, yet anyone who knew the work would have sworn they came off the same bench. She set them side by side on her knee, her grandfather's horse, and this stranger's horse. She looked from one to the other. The hair rose along her arms, because this was not coincidence. This was inheritance. Someone in this ruined place had been taught the same lesson by the same tradition that had shaped her own hands, and the knowledge of it made the empty dugout feel suddenly, impossibly full. Have you ever caught the smell of wood smoke on a cold morning, and known, before you could see the fire, that someone kindred was near? That was the feeling that moved through her then, the certainty of a presence she could not yet name. She loosened the leather pouch with trembling fingers. She poured a small stream of gold into her palm. Coins minted before the war, heavy, cold, catching the light with a dull, honest gleam. It was more money than her grandfather had earned in his best year, more than her uncle had gotten for the whole of his farm. She closed her hand around it, not with greed, with a kind of awe, because money buried this deep, and this carefully was never only money. It was a message. Someone had wanted it found. She untied the leather thong. She unfolded the papers, with the care she would have given a moth's wing. The topmost was a letter. The hand that had written it was careful and square. The letters formed by someone who had learned his penmanship from a copybook and never lost the habit of doing a thing properly. The ink had faded to the brown of old blood. Every word held. To whoever comes after and reads this by the light of the door I built. She read it slowly, her lips moving over the words. As she read, the shelter around her stopped being an accident of the storm. It became the last testament of a man she had never met. His name was Thaddeus Brennan. She read her own family name in that faded ink. She had to stop and press the back of her wrist to her mouth. Thaddeus Brennan, who wrote that he had been the eldest son of a stonemason in County Cork, before the family had come across in the hungry years, who had gone with his younger brother to Pennsylvania, who had watched that brother make his own way west, while he, Thaddeus, had stayed on to run a milling venture with a partner named Ephraim Vance. Vance. The name landed on her like a stone dropped into still water. She did not yet know why, only that some part of her was listening for it now. Thaddeus named his brother in the letter the way a man names a person still dear to him. My brother Silas went to Iowa in the year we buried our father. Silas Brennan. Her grandfather. The letter shook in her hands. She had come into this country believing herself the last living branch of a felled tree. Here in the ground beneath her was proof the tree had another root she had never known. A great uncle, who had carried the same trade and the same blood into this same wilderness a lifetime before her, who had reached forward, across all those silent years, to leave something for anyone of his line, who might one day need it. The land is not given, he had written near the bottom of the first page. It is not inherited by the reading of a will. It belongs to whoever stays. The rest of the letter told the shape of a life. Thaddeus had gone for a soldier when the war came, a young man of 24 who believed what young men believed. He had marched into the worst of it at a river in Virginia called the Rappahannock. On a December morning in 1862, that turned a stone wall on the outskirts of a town called Fredericksburg into a thing he could not afford to describe. Even here, decades later, to a stranger, he wrote only that he had seen enough that day to last 100 lifetimes, that something in him had come loose and would not see it again, that when the guns finally stilled, he had understood he could not go back to it. He had walked away. He did not dress it up as courage. He did not condemn it as cowardice. He simply wrote that he had chosen to live, and that living had cost him his name, because there was a second paper beneath the letter, brittle, official. When Ada unfolded it, she found herself looking at a War Department casualty record, listing one Thaddeus Brennan, private, as killed in action at Fredericksburg on the 13th of December, 1862. A dead man's document, describing a man who had sat at this very hearth, and carved a horse, and sealed this box, with his own hands years afterward. She understood the horror and the cunning of it at once. There had been someone he needed to be dead to. He had let the army bury a name that was still breathing, so he could walk out of the war, and out of his old life, and start again clean in a country too big to be searched. The letter named that someone, Ephraim Vance, who had been Thaddeus's partner in the milling venture before the war, who had held papers over him, who had ruined the elder Brennan in a swindle of leases, and would have taken everything the family had left had Thaddeus come home to inherit it. A dead soldier could inherit nothing, could be pursued for nothing, could be made to sign nothing. So Thaddeus had stayed dead. He had drifted west after the war. He had come to Dakota Territory when the government opened the high country to settlement. He had filed on this quarter section under his own true name in 1872, because out here, 1,000 miles from anyone who had known him, the name Brennan meant nothing to any man alive. He had proved up his claim over 5 hard years. In 1877, the land office had granted him clear title, and the patent to 160 acres of Dakota Territory prairie lay now in Ada's lap, signed in a hand she had already learned to know. She read on, hungry now, turning each page toward the light. He had lived here alone for the better part of a decade. He had built the walls she had sheltered behind, laid the hearth she had cleared, carved the horse she had found. He had grown old without kin, and he had faced the plain fact that when he was gone, there would be no one to hand any of it to. So he had made a decision. He had buried his savings and his story together beneath his own floor, sealed against weather and time. He had written this letter to whoever might someday come. He did not know who it would be. He had hoped, without any way of knowing, that it might somehow be someone of his own blood, someone who would recognize the horse for what it was. I have no way to send this forward, he had written, except to trust the ground to keep it, and to trust that the work will speak to the right hands. If you are of the Brennan line, then the fitting of these stones is your birthright as much as mine. and I am glad past telling that you have come. If you are a stranger, then be welcome anyway. Stay. Make of this place what I could not. Ada sat in the doorway until the sun had climbed well up the sky, and the ice on the prairie had begun to soften and drip. The two horses on her knee, the letter in her hand, the gold against her thigh. She was not weeping, though her face was wet. She was doing something closer to listening, the way she had listened, as a girl, while her grandfather named the world for her, one object at a time. A man cast out by his own war had built a haven, and left it for the family he would never meet. A girl cast out by her own kin had walked into it half dead in a storm. The symmetry of it was too clean to be accident, too strange to be design. She stopped trying to name it. She simply let it be what it was, which was a gift, the truest she had ever been given. You did not throw me away, she said aloud to the empty air. To the great uncle whose bones lay somewhere in this ground. You saved a place for me, before you knew I would need it. A gift buried in the ground, though, was not the same as a gift a person could keep. Ada was her grandfather's grandchild in this above all. She understood that possession and paper were two different animals. The gold would feed her and shelter her. But the land beneath her was worth more than gold, if she could hold it. And holding it would take more than a dead man's letter. It would take the law. She wrapped the box and its contents in the driest of her blankets. She hid it deep in the cleared cavity beneath the granite, seated the slab back over it exactly as it had lain, because a woman alone, with a fortune, had best keep the fortune's existence to herself, until she knew the ground she stood on. Then she took only the patent, the casualty record, the letter, a single gold coin. She set out at first light the next morning to find the nearest settlement, and the nearest person, with the authority to tell her whether the ground she had inherited was truly hers. She walked south and east for the better part of 2 days, following the softening land down out of the high prairie toward the flatter country, where a person might build a town. Rationing the last of her uncle's provisions, sleeping the one night wrapped in her remaining blanket in the lee of a cutbank. On the second afternoon she struck a freight road, a pair of wheel ruts worn deep into the sod. She followed them into a settlement that announced itself first as a smudge of wood smoke, then as a scatter of frame buildings and soddies strung along a single street of frozen mud. A weathered board nailed to the first building she passed named the place Ashcroft Crossing. It was not much: a general store, a livery, a land office, a church not yet finished, a scatter of houses, the sharp cold ring of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere out of sight. To Ada, after the emptiness of the prairie, it looked like the center of the world. She felt the town's eyes on her as she came up the street. A young woman traveling alone on foot, her hem stiff with dried mud, her face burned by wind and want. She met those eyes with her chin level, her pace unhurried. She went first to the general store, because a store was a place where a stranger could ask questions without giving away why. The interior was warm and dim and smelled of coffee and leather and cured meat. Behind the counter, a lean gray man, with spectacles pushed up on his forehead, watched her come in, with the frank assessment of a merchant weighing a new customer. The name painted on the window had read Ostrander. She bought a little flour and a little coffee with the gold coin. She watched the shopkeeper's eyebrows lift a fraction at the sight of it. An old coin, a heavy one, not the sort of footsore girl usually laid on his counter. She let him wonder. "I need to ask a question," she said. "Ask. Where does a person go, in a town like this, to settle a matter about a land claim?" Ostrander's gaze sharpened, with the particular interest of a man who trades in a town's business as much as its goods. "Land office, 2 doors down. Agent's name is Bramley. Careful man. Fair one as such men go." "Thank you." He did not let her turn to leave. He leaned his forearms on the counter. "Mississippi." "Yes." "Land question, you say?" "That's right." He lowered his voice to the tone men use for news they enjoy carrying. You'll want to mind yourself with land questions these days. Will I? There's a fellow been through Ashcroft Crossing more than once lately, buying up quarters, filing on empty ground. What's his name? Warrick Holloway. Smooth one. Money behind him, a lawyer's tongue in his head. Sits on the territorial board over in Yankton, they say. And folks who cross him have a way of finding their claims tangled past sorting. She held his gaze a moment, nodded once. I thank you for the flower, she said. And for the other. She walked out of the store, with the name Warrick Holloway folded against her memory the way her uncle's lie had once folded. Filed. Remembered. Ezra Bramley's office was a cramped room heavy, with the smell of ink and dust and cold pipe smoke. Walls lined with plat books. The single window grimed to the color of weak tea. The agent himself was a spare, deliberate man of middle years. Ink stains worn permanently into the side of his right hand. A way of looking at a document over the top of his spectacles, as though it might try to deceive him. He listened to Ada's account with no expression at all. When she laid the patent on his desk, he did not snatch it up. He studied it a long moment before he touched it, the way a cautious man studies water, before he trusts his weight to the ice. He read it through twice. He held it to the poor light of the window and traced the land office seal with his fingertip, testing the impression. He compared the description on the patent against a heavy plat book he hauled down from the shelf, running his stained finger along the surveyed lines until he found the quarter section that matched. Ada watched his careful face. She could not read whether what he found there was good news or bad. This is a genuine patent, he told her at last, setting it down with more respect than he had picked it up. Issued in '77 to a Thaddeus Brennan. Proved up and granted clear. There's no question the land was his. He looked at her over the spectacles. The only question is what you are to him, and whether the law will see it my way. That is the question. I understand. She had come prepared for exactly that question. This was the moment her grandfather had shaped her for, without either of them knowing it. The moment when a dull mind would have cut crooked, and hers kept keen, cut true. She had not come to beg the agent's kindness. She had not come to lean on the accident of a shared surname, because a shared name proved nothing and she knew it. She reached into her satchel. She drew out the family Bible she had carried out of the wreck of her grandfather's estate, the one solid link to everyone she had lost. She opened it flat on his desk to the pages between the testaments, where 4 generations of Brennans had recorded their births and marriages and deaths in a dozen different hands across 70 years. There, in her great-great-grandfather's crabbed script, was the whole family set down like a foundation course of stone, brother beneath brother. Among the sons of the old stonemason, written plain as a nail-driven true, was Silas Brennan, who had gone west to Iowa to make his own way. Silas Brennan, her grandfather, the next name in that generation written smaller as though the writer had nearly run out of page, was Thaddeus. Bramley bent over the Bible for a long time. He compared the spelling of the names, the dates, the hands. He asked her the name of her grandfather, the name of her father, the county in Iowa where she was born. He wrote her answers down. He checked them against the record before him. She answered every question plainly and without hesitation, because the truth needs no rehearsing. The letter, she told him finally, sliding Thaddeus's testament across the desk, is in his own hand, the same hand as the patent. You can lay them side by side. He does not name me because he could not know me, but he names his blood, and his blood is written here. And I am the last of it. She let the words rest. Then she added the ones that had been forming in her since the doorway of the dugout. He left the land to whoever of his line would come and stay. I have come. I mean to stay. The agent laid the patent and the letter side by side. He bent close over the 2 signatures. The room was silent, but for the tick of a cheap clock and the far-off ring of the blacksmith's hammer. When he straightened, something had changed in his careful face. Some private verdict rendered. "This is the most irregular thing to cross my desk in 11 years, Miss Brennan." For one cold moment she thought she had lost. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "It is also, unless I am a poorer judge of men and documents than I take myself for, entirely true. The hands match. The blood is recorded. There is no competing heir. No will to contest. The claim has never been challenged in 9 years." He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him, uncapped his ink. "It will take filings, a notice period, patience. But I believe I can transfer this patent into your name and make it stand." He dipped his pen. "Welcome to Custer County. You appear to be a landowner." She walked out of that office into the hard, bright cold, with the taste of something she had almost forgotten. It took her a moment on the frozen street to name it as hope. She was not merely a survivor of a storm now. She was Brennan, of the old Brennan place, owner of 160 acres. The knowledge sat in her chest, with a warmth no fire had given her. She had learned, though, that the world does not hand a person good fortune without sending someone to try and take it. She had not gone 20 steps up the street before she saw the man who would. He was standing outside the land office, as though he had been waiting. A tall, well-fed man in a good wool coat and clean boots that had never known the kind of work her own hands had done. He was watching her come out of Bramley's door with an interest that was not casual. He introduced himself with a smile that showed a great many teeth and stopped well short of his eyes. Warrick Holloway. The name landed on her the way it had landed at Ostrander's counter, spreading in still water. He had a soft, reasonable voice, the voice of a man used to talking others around to his way. He had, he said, heard she had come in about the old Brennan quarter up in the high grass. A worthless piece of ground, he called it, all sand and thistle, no water a man could reach, not worth the trouble of holding through a Dakota winter. He was doing folks a service, he said, taking such dead claims off their hands. "I'll give you $60 cash this afternoon. For your signature. Save yourself the winter. Save yourself the filing fees." Ada looked at his clean boots, at his easy smile, at the eyes that stayed cold above it. She understood several things at once. She understood that a man did not ride out of his way to offer $60 for ground he called worthless. She understood that Ostrander's warning had a face now, and that the face was smiling at her. She understood, with a certainty that settled into her like the fit of stone on stone, that whatever this man wanted from that land was worth a great deal more than $60. And the first task of holding her inheritance would be to find out what it was, before he took it from her. "I thank you for the offer, Mr. Holloway." "Miss Brennan. But a thing a man offers to buy sight unseen is never worthless." "That's so. I believe I'll keep it." She stepped around him. She walked on up the street. She felt his smile go cold at her back. She knew she had made an enemy. She found she did not much care. She could not walk the 2 days back to the dugout that afternoon. She took a room for the night above the livery. It was there, over a supper of stew brought up by the liveryman's wife, that she began in earnest to learn the country she had inherited. She asked her questions carefully, the way a person pans a stream, letting the useless gravel wash away. She learned that the whole of that high country was reckoned poor, because water lay too deep beneath it to reach with hand-dug wells. Folks knew that a man might own 1,000 acres up there, and watch his cattle go thin, within sight of grass to their bellies. She learned that the one thing worth more than gold in that dry land was a reliable source of water. A spring, a shallow place, where the buried water rose close enough to bring up, and that a quarter section with living water on it was worth 10 around it that had none. She sat very still, with her spoon halfway to her mouth, because she remembered the thread of darker green she had followed down out of the high country in the storm, the swale that had deepened into a draw. The reason a man had chosen that particular fold of the earth to dig his home into a lifetime ago. Thaddeus Brennan had not settled a random hillside. He had settled water. She understood then what Holloway wanted. The understanding changed the shape of everything. He was not buying worthless Prairie. He was buying, or trying to buy, the one thing that made all the prairie around it worth having. If he knew what lay under the old Brennan quarter, then he knew a great deal more about that country than a girl fresh out of a storm. He would not stop at a smiling offer of $60. She lay awake much of that night on the strange bed, with the sounds of the horses shifting below her, turning the problem the way she would turn a warped board, looking for the true line in it. By morning she had resolved that she would not be driven off her ground by any man's smile or any man's threat. She had been thrown away once already in her life. She would not be thrown away from the one place in the world that was hers. She spent the whole of the next day in Ashcroft Crossing before starting back. She spent it making herself known, because a woman alone on a far quarter was easy to push. A woman with neighbors was not. She hired at the livery the service of a freighter to haul supplies out to the old Brennan place. A lean, weathered man named Jonas Deacon, who had hauled goods across that country for 20 years, who received her request to freight to the abandoned dugout with no more surprise than a slow blink. Folks said that place was haunted, he told her, loading her purchases into his wagon, or fell in on itself years back. I'm making it my home. He looked at her a long, considering moment, then gave a single nod, as though she had passed a test she had not known she was taking. He told her to climb up. She had spent a portion of Thaddeus's gold carefully on the things a homestead needed and a person could not make from grass and clay: a good axe and a crosscut saw and a broad froe for splitting shakes, sacks of flour and beans and coffee and salt, a small squat cast iron stove that would be the warm heart of the place, lengths of stove pipe, nails which no one could forge on the open prairie, a shovel, a mattock, a coil of good rope. She loaded her future into Jonas Deacon's wagon, climbed up beside him. They rolled north out of Ashcroft Crossing into the great grass ocean of the high country. The journey passed in the companionable near silence of two people who did not feel the need to fill it. Jonas handled his team with the same economy of motion her grandfather had brought to his tools. Ada watched the country come back to her. The folds and swells she had crossed half dead in the storm, now merely cold and beautiful under a hard blue sky. When at last they crested the final rise, and the broken mound of the dugout came into view below them, she felt the freighter beside her take it in. The caved roof, the tumbled entrance, the three standing walls. He drew up the team. He looked at it a long while. Good stonework, he said finally, the way another man might have paid a high compliment to a woman's face. That'll stand when the rest of us are gone. Ada, who had felt the truth of those walls under her own hands in the dark, found her throat tight, because it was the highest praise she could have imagined, and it belonged, in the end, to a dead man she had never met. Jonas helped her unload. The two of them wrestled the little stove down off the wagon and in through the tumbled doorway, set it in the corner where Thaddeus's old hearth had been, so the new fire would burn where the old one had. Before he climbed back up to leave, he stood in the ruined doorway and cast his experienced eye over the place. The cleared floor, the half-roof she had rigged, the stone walls waiting. You aim to winter here. It was not quite a question. She looked at the walls her great-uncle had built, at the sky her own hands would have to close against the coming snow. I aim to do more than winter. That's so. I aim to bring this place back. He nodded slowly. He reached into the bed of his wagon. He handed down to her a small sack of oats and a bundle of old newspapers, without a word of explanation, as though a person alone on the prairie should not want for something to feed a horse she did not yet own, or something to read by the fire. Then he clucked to his team. He rolled back the way they had come. Ada stood alone with her stove and her tools and watched him go, until the wagon was only a dark mark on the pale country. She did not let herself feel the loneliness. She turned to the work instead, because the snow would not wait on her feelings. The work of the next weeks was the hardest and the most satisfying of her life. She felled straight young pines, from a grove she found along the water in the draw. Limbing and squaring them the way Silas had shown her. She set them into the notches in the stone walls to rebuild the roof. So her great-uncle's walls and her timber rose together into one whole thing. She cut thick squares of sod from the hillside, heavy, root-bound, laid them over the beams in overlapping courses to make a living roof that would shed the rain and hold the heat. She split cedar shakes with the new froe. She hung a stout door on leather hinges. She chinked the gaps in the old stonework with a mud she mixed from the very earth of the floor, sealing out the wind that had nearly finished her. She was not left entirely alone in it. On an afternoon when the sky hung low and gray with the threat of the season's first true snow, a woman rode out from the direction of Ashcroft Crossing on a sturdy bay mare. A widow named Delia Rourke, who kept a small place a half-day to the south, who had heard, in the way news travels in empty country, that a young woman was fixing to winter alone up at the old Brennan quarter. She brought a covered pot of stew still warm from her own stove, a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth. She brought with her a boy of about 7. Her son Micah, a solemn child with his mother's steady eyes, who watched Ada split a shake with frank fascination, who asked, when he had worked up the courage, whether she had truly built the roof herself. Every board of it, she told him. She handed him the froe and the mallet. She stood behind him with her hands over his small ones, the way a big calloused hand had once closed over hers. She helped him drive a shake clean off a block of cedar. The boy's face lit, as though she had handed him a coin of pure gold. Something turned over in Ada's chest, some warmth she had not felt since a churchyard in Iowa. Delia said little as she looked over the homestead. Her eyes missed nothing: the neat stack of split wood, the smoke curling straight from the new stovepipe, the sod roof laid tight as a drum. "You've got a builder's hands," she said at last, standing in the doorway with her son at her hip. It was the thing Ada most needed to hear, and had not known she needed. The two women stood while in the failing light, and spoke of practical things, of where the deep snow drifted worst, where the cattle sheltered in a blizzard, where a person might dig for water if the draw froze solid. Before she rode away, with her boy up behind her, Delia turned in the saddle and looked back at the small lit window, glowing gold against the dusk. There's not many would have made a home of that ruin. Most would have called it worthless and walked on. Then she was gone into the gathering dark. Ada stood in her doorway. She understood that the thread by which she held this life was no longer a single strand. It was beginning slowly to braid itself into something that might bear weight. The community did not form through speeches. It formed through the small currency of the frontier, the loaf of bread and the sack of oats, the shared knowledge of where the snow drifted and the water rose. Jonas Deacon made the old Brennan place a regular stop on his freight route through the high country. He never came empty-handed. Ada learned to have a pot of strong coffee waiting hot on the stove against the hour of his arrival, so the two of them could sit while on a bench she had built by her own door, speak of the weather, the price of beef, the state of the roads. Ostrander at the store began to set aside a particular cut of bacon he had marked as her preference. Delia rode out again with garden seed and hardy cuttings, the promise of teaching her, which would grow in that thin soil come spring. The girl who had been left in the grass to be forgotten was, quarter by quarter and week by week, becoming a person the country knew by name. Warrick Holloway had not forgotten her either. A smiling man refused is a more dangerous animal than a smiling man obeyed. He came out to the homestead himself on a bitter afternoon in the deep of that first winter, riding a fine horse that steamed in the cold. He did not smile this time. He sat his saddle looking down at the transformed dugout, the tight roof, the true door, the smoke of a fire that had no business burning in a place he had counted on standing empty. She saw the calculation move behind his eyes, as he understood his $60 problem had put down roots. He drew a folded paper from his coat, with the deliberate slowness of a man laying down a winning hand. He told her, in that soft, reasonable voice gone hard at the edges, that he was sorry to bring her bad news. "Miss Brennan, Mr. Holloway, your claim to this ground is not so clear as old Bramley led you to believe. That's so. There is a prior filing on this exact quarter, made and recorded before ever your dead soldier proved up. By whom? That's the thing. By whom? By an interest that has now sold that claim. To me." He held the paper. He did not offer it. He dangled it, the way a man dangles bait. "By rights the land is spoken for. You had best pack your things while the weather still allows it. Come the spring thaw I will have the law out to see you off ground. That is legally mine." Ada did not reach for the paper, because she had learned long ago that a document a liar is eager to show you is a document you must never accept at face value. She stood in her own doorway, with the warmth of her own fire at her back. She looked up at the mounted man with his false paper and his cold smile. She felt not fear, but a slow cold clarity, settling over her like the first hard frost over the high country. A man who owned a true prior claim, Mr. Holloway, yes, would have gone to Bramley. Would he? And had me put off by the law, perhaps. He would not have ridden out here alone to frighten a girl into signing. Silence. You are showing me that paper because it cannot stand where the light gets at it. He went very still in the saddle, the smile draining from his face, like water from cracked ice. In that stillness she read the truth plainer than any document. The filing was a forgery. He had gambled she would be too frightened or too ignorant to know it. She thought of Ostrander's warning, of the tangled claims and the ruined settlers. She understood she had just refused a man who did not lose gracefully. "Get off my land." The first time in her life she had ever spoken those 3 words, and had the right to them. The having of the right straightened her spine like a steel rod. "This ground was left to me by a man who stayed when everyone he trusted had betrayed him. Miss Brennan, I mean to do the same. You are making a mistake. Now go." Holloway did not answer her from the saddle. He folded the false paper back into his coat, with the care of a man returning a knife to its sheath. He wheeled his steaming horse. He rode off south into the failing light, without another word. The silence he left behind him was worse than any threat, because it was the silence of a man who had stopped bargaining and begun to plan. The plan did not take long to show its shape. 3 nights later, in a wind that came down out of the north, with the smell of coming snow, Ada woke to a sound that did not belong. A soft, heavy thump in the yard. Then another. Then the frightened bawling of one of the 2 milk cows she had bought, that fall from a neighbor's herd. She was up, coat over her nightdress, grandfather's hatchet in her hand. Out the door. She found the first cow already down, his throat opened cleanly, its blood smoking in the cold. The second she found in the draw 20 yards off. Struggling, not yet dead. She had to finish what a stranger had begun, with her own hand, on her knees in the frozen mud, whispering to the animal as it died, because she had raised it from a heifer, and it deserved not to go alone. There was no track she could follow. The ground was frozen too hard. The wind had already smoothed the little there was. She stood in her yard, with the blood on her hands. She understood what she had been told. A week later the woodshed burned. She was inside the dugout when she smelled it. She came out to a red glow against the black sky, and the whole side of the shed already gone. She fought it with a shovel and thrown snow until her hands blistered, and the wind finally turned it out. Half her wood for the winter, gone. Sheriff Kearns rode out from Ashcroft Crossing the next day, when Jonas Deacon sent word. A big man with a face like a wet sack, small eyes. He looked at the burned shed. He looked at the 2 dead cows Ada had dragged clear. He yawned. "Careless with your fires, Miss Brennan. The shed was cold." "Was it? There was no fire in it." "So you say. And the cows?" "Wolves. Wolves don't cut throats clean, Sheriff. You saying different. I'm saying different. He shrugged. He mounted his horse. He rode away. Ada watched him go, and understood who paid his coat. She went down into the draw the next morning with the shovel and the mattock, because she had understood, sitting up all that night beside her burning shed, that the time had come to know for herself what lay under the old Brennan quarter. She dug in the lowest fold of the draw, where the dark green thread had run in the summer grass, where the water's memory still stood in the shape of the land. The ground was hard with frost, the first foot down, then softened, then went dark and damp against the blade in a way no other soil in that dry country did. She dug through the short cold day, resting when her back demanded it, driving herself back to the work, because the answer was down there and she meant to have it, at a depth of some 9 feet, standing in a pit to her shoulders, with her breath smoking above her. The mattock bit into ground that welled. Water rose cold and clear around her boots, filling the bottom of the pit faster than the winter cold could freeze it. She stood in it up to her ankles. She laughed aloud in the empty draw, a sound that startled her own ears. Thaddeus Brennan had not settled poor ground. He had settled a fortune. He had buried the proof of it in the one place no thief would think to look, which was under everyone's feet. She understood now the whole shape of the thing. Holloway was not buying Prairie. He was buying the key to a kingdom of it. She had just dug up his secret with her own 2 hands. The knowing of it made her both far richer, and far more in danger, than she had been at dawn. She filled the pit only enough to keep the water from freezing to the bottom, rigged a rough cover of split planks over it, told no one, because a secret shared before its time was a secret spent. Through the short bitter days that followed, she went on, with the work of holding her home together against the winter. She went on with a new purpose threaded through it. She was not merely surviving now. She was preparing for a fight. She knew from her grandfather that the only way to win against a man with better tools was to know the ground better than he did, and to strike where he did not expect it. The storm that would give her that chance came sooner than she wished. It came down out of the north in the 2nd week of January, a blizzard that emptied the country of every living thing that could find a hole to hide in. Ada had wood laid in, what was left of it. The roof held tight. She banked her fire. She rode the storm out in the warm heart of the home she had built. It was on the 2nd day of that blizzard, when the snow had led up to a hard steady fall. The wind still tore the tops off the drifts, that she heard the sound, over the weather, that turned her blood to ice water. A high thin cry. That was not the wind, not any animal, coming faint and broken from the direction of the draw. She was into her coat and out the door before she had finished thinking. Because there are sounds a person's body answers before the mind can weigh the cost. Delia Rourke's boy, Micah, was out there in the white. She knew it in her bones before she knew anything else. Though how a child came to be in the high country in a blizzard she could not guess. She followed the cry down into the wind, floundering through drifts to her thighs, calling the boy's name into the storm. She used the one thing she had that Warrick Holloway never would, which was the country itself. Read the way Silas Brennan had taught her to read the grain of wood. She did not blunder blind. She read the shape of the land under the snow, the way the drifts built on the lee of every rise, the way a small frightened creature would move downhill and downwind, seeking shelter. Exactly as she had sought it in her own first storm, she let that knowledge steer her feet, where her eyes could not. She found him where the draw made its first sharp fold, tucked into the hollow beneath an overhanging cutbank, where the snow could not reach, curled small, his back to the frozen earth, exactly as instinct and terrain had promised her he would be. He had done everything right. He had gotten out of the wind, put his back to a solid wall, kept himself still and low. The shelter of the bank had held the worst of the cold off him. When Ada's hands closed on his shoulders, he blinked up at her, dazed but whole, cold and frightened, but unhurt. She wrapped him inside her own coat against her body, sharing what warmth she had. She pressed her cheek to his hair. "I've got you." His small hands fisted in her shirt. "Miss Brennan. I've got you, Micah. My mama. Tell me." She took the fever. She couldn't get up. There wasn't anybody else. "You came to fetch me. I remembered the way. You did everything a grown man could have done. The storm caught me. You got yourself out of the weather. You waited. That's not luck, Micah. It isn't. That's sense. And sense is the thing that keeps a person alive." She got him up out of the draw against the wind. She got him inside, stripped his snow-crusted outer things, set him close by the stove, wrapped in her own dry blanket, warming him slowly the way you warm anything that has been near frozen, never fast, feeding him warm broth in spoonfuls until the color came back into his cheeks and the dazed look left his eyes. It was only when she was certain the child was safe that she let herself feel the second fear behind the first, because Micah had come to fetch her to his mother, and Delia lay alone and feverish a half-day's ride to the south, with a storm still blowing itself out over the country. She could not take a chilled boy back out into it, nor leave him alone in the dugout while she rode for help. She could not reach Delia through a blizzard on foot without ending as two people needing rescue instead of one. She made the only choice the situation allowed. She made it without flinching. She kept the boy warm and fed through the night, at the first gray hint of the storm breaking. She bundled him warm on the little pony she had bought that fall. She led them both south. The wind dropped enough to travel. They moved as fast as the drifts allowed. Praying the fever had not gotten ahead of them, they reached the Rourke place by mid-morning, to find that Delia's nearest neighbor, a rancher's wife, who had thought to check on the widow when the storm broke, had already reached her, gotten broth and cool cloths into her, turned the fever an hour before Ada arrived. The widow was weak and hollow-eyed, but mending, sitting propped against her pillows. When her son ran to her, she gathered him in. She looked over his head at the young woman standing snow-melted and exhausted in her doorway. No word passed between them that the look did not carry better. "You went out into that for my boy." "I did what you would have done for mine." Ada said it though she had none. In the saying of it, she discovered that this hard, unforgiving country that had thrown her away had somehow, in the space of a single winter, given her a place among people who would go into a storm for one another, which was a thing her whole life until now had never held. The story of that night traveled the county faster than any lie of Holloway's could keep up with, because there is a kind of truth no forger can counterfeit. It is the truth of a person's actions right when no one is watching for reward. The girl who had been called a squatter and a fraud in the streets of Ashcroft Crossing was now the girl who had gone alone into a blizzard for a widow's child, who had read the storm country like a book to find him, who had asked for nothing after. Folks who had half believed Holloway's whispers found the whispers curdling in their mouths. Ostrander at the store told the tale to every customer who came in. Jonas Deacon told it at the livery. By the time the snow had begun to soften along the south faces of the rises, the wind in Ashcroft Crossing had shifted. It had shifted against the smiling man with the fine coat and the two eager papers, which did not mean Holloway had stopped. Jonas brought her the news on a raw afternoon in the middle of February, sitting on her bench by the door with a cup of her coffee steaming in his hands. Holloway had been busy while she wintered. He had filed his forged prior claim with the county recorder over Bramley's objection. He had lodged a formal challenge to her patent. He had let it be known around town that the girl squatting on the old Brennan quarter was a fraud who had gulled a trusting land agent with a stolen Bible and a forged letter. There was to be a formal hearing in the spring, before a special agent of the General Land Office sent up from the territorial capital, a man with authority to rule on contested claims. And Holloway had already retained a lawyer. He was said to have witnesses ready to swear his prior filing was genuine. Against all that, Jonas said, looking at her, over the rim of his cup, with a plain, unhappy honesty. She had a dead man's letter and a family Bible. Folks were already saying both could be forged by anyone with ink and patience. You ought to know the size of what's coming, he told her. I appreciate it. A person fights a storm better, with their eyes open. That they do, Mr. Deacon. That they do. She did not despair, because despair was a luxury for people who had somewhere else to go. She had nowhere, and nothing but this ground, and the truth of it. She sat down that night at her table with Thaddeus's letter, and the patent, and the casualty record spread, before her in the lamplight. She studied them, not as treasures now, as evidence, the way Bramley had studied them, looking for the thing in them that no forger could counterfeit. Slowly, over several nights of close looking, she found her line. A forger could copy a signature. A forger could age paper over a stove. A forger could mimic a faded hand. But the casualty record listing Thaddeus Brennan as killed at Fredericksburg was a genuine War Department document, filed and sealed by the government itself in the second year of the war. It existed in copy in the Army's own records in Washington, proved that the man who had filed on this land in '72 had first been declared dead by the very government he was now homesteading under. No forger inventing a false claimant would ever manufacture a document proving his own claimant had been legally dead 10 years before he filed. It was the one thread in the whole tangle that pointed, unmistakably, at a real and living Thaddeus Brennan. It was the thread she resolved she would pull, until the whole of Holloway's cloth came apart. A document in Washington, though, did a girl in a Dakota dugout no good, unless she could get its confirmation into the hands of the agent who would judge her, which meant she could not simply hide in the high country and wait for the spring hearing. She would have to write to the War Department herself, request a certified copy of the record under the government's own seal. Pray it came back before the hearing. The next time Jonas passed through, she sent a letter out with him to be posted from Ashcroft Crossing. A careful letter composed over many drafts in her grandfather's plain, honest style, requesting official confirmation of the death record of Private Thaddeus Brennan at Fredericksburg, December 13th of 1862. She settled into the hardest labor of all, which was waiting on a distant office through the dead heart of winter. With everything she had riding on a reply, she could not hurry. She kept moving because motion was the one thing that kept the fear of the hearing from settling into her chest and taking root there. She hauled more stone from the draw and began the foundation of a small addition to the dugout. A second room, in case the answer came right, in case there was ever more than one Brennan in this house again. She dug her well deeper, fitted timber into its sides so the walls would not slump when the spring melt came. She built the frame of a proper pump above it. She waited. The letter from Washington came on the second Tuesday in April, carried out to her by a proud and breathless Jonas Deacon, who had ridden straight from the Ashcroft Crossing post office rather than wait for his route. A heavy envelope sealed with the government's own wax. Ada opened it with hands that shook for the first time since she had lifted the box from beneath the granite. Inside was exactly what she had prayed for: a certified copy under official seal of the service and casualty record of Private Thaddeus Brennan, confirming in the government's own unimpeachable hand that the man had been carried on the Army's rolls as killed in action at Fredericksburg on the 13th of December, 1862. The one document Holloway could never explain. The one thread that proved a real Thaddeus Brennan had lived and filed and died was now hers, in a form no lawyer could wave away. There was one more thing in the envelope. She almost missed it: a folded slip of paper tucked between the certified record and the government letter of transmittal. Private note, written in a clerk's careful hand on a plain sheet of War Department stationery. Miss Brennan, in processing your request, this office was obliged to examine the file of Private Thaddeus Brennan. In doing so, I noted an unusual entry made in the year 1863 by a Mr. Ephraim Vance of Pennsylvania, who inquired at length about the circumstances of the private's death, and requested documentation for the purpose of settling estate matters. Mr. Vance's inquiries continued at intervals until 1878, when this office received notice of his own passing. The file has been closed accordingly. I include this only in case it should be of use to you. Yours faithfully, L. Whitaker, Records Clerk. Ada sat with the note in her hands for a long time. The lamp burning low, the stove ticking in the corner, the wind moving over the sod above her head. She understood then the whole weight of what her great-uncle had carried. He had not simply walked away from a war. He had spent the rest of his life knowing that the man he had walked away from was still hunting him, year after year, letter after letter to a government that could not tell Vance what he wanted, because the government itself believed the lie Thaddeus had planted. 15 years of a stranger's pursuit. 15 years of a small cold dread in the back of a man's mind, made bearable only by the walls of stone he had set with his own hands, by the horse he had carved and set on a shelf, by the letter he had written into the dark of the future, trusting that someone would come and find it and know. She folded the clerk's note carefully. She placed it inside the family Bible for safekeeping. Some kindnesses deserve to be kept. Spring came to the Dakota high country the way it comes to hard country, all at once and grudging, the snow going off in a rush that filled every low place with running water and turned the grass a green, so sudden it seemed to hurt the eyes. With the thaw came also the day of the hearing. Ada rode into Ashcroft Crossing on her pony, in the plain, clean clothes of a working woman, carrying the whole of her case in the leather satchel that had once held only a slate and a wooden horse. The hearing was held in the largest room the town could offer, the half-finished church, its raw pine walls smelling of pitch, its benches full of the people of Custer County, come to see how the thing would fall out. The special agent from the General Land Office sat at a plain table at the front, a graying, unsmiling man named Merrick, with the tired, patient eyes of someone who had spent a career sorting honest claimants from thieves, who had grown hard to fool in either direction. Bramley sat to one side, with his plat books and his stained hands, looking grimmer than Ada had ever seen him. Across the aisle sat Warrick Holloway in a coat finer than any in the room, his lawyer beside him, his face arranged into the confident ease of a man who had bought his outcome in advance. Holloway's lawyer laid out the challenge first. He laid it out well, in the smooth, rolling phrases of a man paid to make crooked things look straight. His client held a prior filing on the disputed quarter, recorded and witnessed, predating the patent of the deceased Thaddeus Brennan. The young woman now occupying the land had produced only a suspiciously convenient letter, an unverifiable family Bible, to support a claim of kinship to a man conveniently dead these many years. The letter could be forged. The Bible could be doctored. The whole tale of a long-lost great-uncle in a buried box, he suggested with a thin smile, had the ring of a fireside story rather than a legal fact. He asked the agent to reject the girl's claim, void the improperly granted patent, confirm his client's prior right to the land. Ada listened to herself called a liar and a fraud before her neighbors, without a flicker crossing her face. She had been dismissed by better men than Warrick Holloway. She had learned that the way to answer contempt was not with heat, but with proof. When Merrick turned his tired eyes to her and asked what she had to say, she rose. She did not raise her voice. She laid her case down before him, plank by plank, the way her grandfather had taught her to build a thing that would stand. She laid down the patent, genuine, unchallenged for 9 years, until the moment its true heir appeared to claim it. She laid down the family Bible, open to the generations of Brennans, recorded in 70 years of changing hands. She invited the agent to find any sign that the name Thaddeus had been added later than the rest, knowing he would find none, because it had been set down by her great-great-grandfather before Thaddeus was ever a soldier, or a settler, or a dead man. Then she laid down her killing stroke. She placed the War Department's certified record on the table before the agent, its official seal bright in the raw spring light through the church's unfinished windows. She let him read it before she spoke. That document, the room quieted, comes not from me, but from the government of the United States, under its own seal. And it says that Thaddeus Brennan was declared killed at Fredericksburg in the winter of 1862. She let that settle. Now I ask a plain question. If Mr. Holloway's story is true, if some other man filed a prior and honest claim on this land, then who is the Thaddeus Brennan named in the patent that Mr. Bramley granted in '77? She turned toward Holloway for the first time. Her voice never rose, but it filled the raw pine room to its rafters. There is only one man that patent could belong to. A soldier the army buried on paper, so that a swindler could not follow him west and take everything his family had left. My great-uncle did not fake his own death to cheat anyone. He did it to escape a man exactly like the one who is trying to cheat me now, and the proof of who he was is not written by my hand or bought by Mr. Holloway's money. It is written by the War Department, and it cannot be forged, because it was sealed long before I was born, or Mr. Holloway ever set eyes on this county. The room had gone silent, in the particular way a room goes silent when the truth walks into it, and everyone recognizes it at once. Marye read the certified record a second time, slowly, then read Thaddeus's letter beside it, then asked to see Holloway's prior filing. The forged paper the man had waved in Ada's doorway all that bitter winter. Holloway's lawyer passed it up with a confidence that had begun very slightly to fray at its edges. The agent laid it beside the genuine patent. He bent over the two. Ada watched his face and knew what he was seeing, because she had spent whole nights seeing it herself. The paper of the forged filing was too new. The ink sat too dark. The land office seal upon it. When Marye compared it to the genuine seals in Bramley's plat books, was a fraction wrong in the spacing of its letters. The work of a man who had seen such a seal, but never studied one at length. It was the date that finished it. The forged filing claimed to predate Thaddeus's patent, which meant it claimed to have been recorded in a year when Bramley testified, rising with 16 years of careful records to back him. That particular land office had used a different seal entirely. A seal Marye now held up beside the forgery for the whole room to see, did not match. Warrick Holloway's confidence did not so much break as dissolve. The ease running out of his face, like color out of the sky at dusk. For the first time, since he had smiled at her outside the land office, Ada saw the man underneath the coat. He was smaller than his tailoring had made him look. He began to speak, to explain. His lawyer's hand came down on his arm to stop him. Too late, because Marye had already turned to him, with the flat, cold attention of a man whose patience has found its true target at last. Mr. Holloway, sir, if I may. You may not, sir. This filing is a forgery. Sir, the forging of a land office document is not a matter I settle here. Sir, it is a federal crime, Mr. Holloway. It will go to the United States Attorney with my full report. He gathered the false paper as evidence. He confirmed in the same breath that the patent to the quarter section was valid, that Ada Brennan had proven her kinship to its original grantee beyond any reasonable doubt, that the land was hers, free and clear, as it had been meant to be, from the day her great-uncle first turned a spade of its earth. The people on the raw pine benches did not cheer. They were frontier people and not given to it. A low murmur moved through them, warmer than any cheer. Ada stood in the middle of it. She felt the ground settle solid beneath her feet at last. It was later, out in the thin spring sunshine on the muddy street. With the hearing done, and Holloway led off to answer for himself to larger authorities than any in Ashcroft Crossing, that the winter's last surprise found her. A wagon came slow up the street. Poor thing, with a mismatched team. a load that spoke of a family's whole life packed in defeat. Ada knew the two figures on its seat before the wheels had stopped turning. Though a year and a hard road had aged them past what a year should, Ansel Doyle drew up his team, sat looking down at her. There was nothing left in his face of the man who had pronounced her wagon's axle cracked on a frozen morning and driven off toward the promised valleys of Oregon. He was gaunt, gray, beaten. Beside him Rhoda sat, with her eyes down, and her hands twisted in her lap. Ada understood before a word was spoken that the promised land had eaten them alive. The story came out of Ansel in halting pieces. A proud man's confession dragged from him by need. The company had reached the Willamette Valley. There a smooth-talking man with fine papers and a lawyer's tongue had sold them a farm that turned out to belong to 3 other buyers besides. A swindle so complete it had taken every dollar from the sale of the Iowa place. Left them with a worthless deed and no way home. They had spent the winter in a shack outside Portland. Ansel doing day labor, Rhoda taking in washing. They had made their way east by degrees, selling what they had left, working when they could. They had heard, at a wagon camp in Wyoming, that a young woman named Brennan held a claim in Dakota Territory that a certain speculator had tried to steal. Ansel had known the name. He had known the story shape. He had turned the team north. Not, he said, to ask anything of her. He had no right to ask. He had only come to see if it was true, to say to her face the thing he had never said, which was that he had done her a wrong out there on the prairie, that no hard luck of his own could ever balance. He looked older than his years, emptied of everything but the shame. Rhoda beside him had begun to weep without sound. Ada stood there in the mud of Ashcroft Crossing. She held in her hands a power she had never expected to hold, which was the power to turn away the 2 people who had turned her away, to do it with the whole county watching, with every right in the world on her side. She could have. Some part of her wanted to. The part of her that had felt the frost on the wagon canvas that September morning and known the axle was sound and known her uncle was lying. That part of her wanted very badly, for one bright hot second, to speak the words her uncle had earned. She thought instead of a great uncle, who could have spent his whole life hating the man who wronged him, who had instead spent it building a place where the next lost soul of his family would be safe. She thought of the letter that had told her the land belonged to whoever stayed. She looked at her uncle's ruined face, found, somewhat to her own surprise, that there was no satisfaction to be had in it. The karma she might have savored had turned to ashes the moment it lay within her reach. Because a heart bent on paying back cruelty becomes the very thing it hates. She was quiet a long time, the town looking on. I ought to send you off the way you sent me. Ansel flinched. He nodded once, as though he had expected the words, as though he would accept them. Rhoda's shoulders shook. Ada did not finish there. I had a great uncle who could have spent his whole life hating the man who wronged him. Instead, he spent it building a place where the next lost soul of his family would be safe. He did not know it would be me. He only trusted that whoever came would be welcome. She looked at them a long moment, at the failed team, at the packed wagon, at the 2 beaten people on the seat. There is grass on my land no one is grazing, and water no one is drinking, and more work than 1 pair of hands can do. I cannot give you what you threw away in Oregon, but I can give you honest work, and a roof, if you can bring yourselves to take wages from the girl you left in the grass. Ansel Doyle put his gaunt face in his hands. He wept like a man who had been holding it back 1,000 miles. Rhoda climbed down off the wagon. She crossed to Ada. She took her hands. She could not speak at all. The thing that passed between the 3 of them in the mud of Ashcroft Crossing was not forgiveness exactly. Some wrongs are too large to be dissolved by a single act. It was a beginning, a foundation course laid down for whatever might be built on it in the seasons to come. Blood does not always mean loyalty. Ada had learned in the hardest way a person can learn it. But sometimes it means a second chance. The giving of that chance costs the giver nothing but pride, which is the cheapest thing a person owns, the hardest to spend. The spring did not stay a secret long, because a thing that valuable cannot be hidden once a person decides to use it. Through that first green season Ada timbered the sides of the well she had opened in the draw, set a hand pump above it, ran shallow ditches out along the contour of the low ground, the way her grandfather had taught her to follow the true fall of a surface. So water her great-uncle had only ever drawn a bucket at a time, now spread out across a stretch that had been the color of a lion's hide when she found it. Cattle came to that water from 3 ranches, whose owners had once watched their stock go thin, within sight of belly-high grass. They paid her honestly for the drinking of it. Those coins she did not bury. They went back into timber, into stock, into a second room, rising off the old stone walls. Ansel learned to swing a scythe again at an age when most men have set theirs down. He did it without a word of complaint, for a man handed back his usefulness will forgive a great deal, himself the slowest of all. Rhoda kept the garden Delia had shown her how to coax, from the thin soil. A path wore itself between the Brennan place and the Rourke place that had not been there the winter before. Micah grew tall enough by harvest to drive a shake clean off a cedar block, with no hand steadying his own. He carried himself proud around the roof he had helped mend, the way a person always does with a thing they have repaired, rather than paid for on the shelf. Warrick Holloway went to trial in the territorial capital in the last week of June, the forgery of a land office document being a federal offense, the evidence being what it was. He was convicted. He was sentenced. He went to prison for a term of years. Ada did not travel to hear the verdict. She had a summer's worth of work to do. She heard about it a week later when Jonas Deacon came through on his route. She was in the draw with Ansel that morning, setting the last of the pump timbers. Jonas told her. She listened. She thanked him. She went back to setting the timbers, because a person who has built her own house does not need to watch a bad man's roof fall to know that roofs badly built fall in the end. There was a Sunday in September, almost exactly 1 year to the day, since her uncle had left her on the swell of grass, with the frost on the canvas, and the lie about the axle. Delia Rourke rode out with Micah behind her. They came for supper. They came often now. The 4 of them ate at the plank table Ada had built, with her own hands in the second room she and Ansel had raised off the old stone walls. Ansel said grace, his voice rougher than it used to be, more honest. Rhoda passed the bread. Delia laughed at something Micah said. The stove ticked. The evening light lay gold across the packed earth floor. After supper Ada took Micah to the shelf above the stove. On that shelf she had set 3 small things in a row. The slate, worn to a saddle by a lifetime of keeping edges true. The wooden horse she had carved, as a grieving girl of 6 beneath a guiding thumb. The wooden horse Thaddeus Brennan had shaped alone in this same room a lifetime, before her hand ever touched a knife. 2 horses off 2 benches 1,000 miles apart, cut by 2 brothers who never once stood in a room together, who had between them across all that distance and all those years built the same lost girl a home. She lifted down the smaller of the 2 horses, the one she had carved at 6. She put it in Micah's hand. His eyes went round. Miss Brennan. You keep it, Micah. But it's yours. It was made for keeping small hands company. It ought to go on doing that. Yes, ma'am. There's one thing, though. Yes, ma'am. You have to learn to make one of your own. That's the price. His face lit, the way it had the first time she put the fro in his hands. She set him on the stool by the fire, set a block of soft pine on his knee, set her grandfather's small knife in his fingers. She closed her rough hand over his smaller one, the way a big calloused hand had once closed over hers, the way, perhaps, an even older hand had closed over Thaddeus Brennan's on a Pennsylvania afternoon in the 1840s. Some things pass down, not because a will is read, because a hand is guided. The pine curled away in a long pale ribbon. Micah watched it fall. He was 7 years old. He did not know that he had just been handed the thing that might one day keep him alive. The land does not ask your name. It asks whether you mean to stay. Ada Brennan had come into that country carrying a slate and a carved horse, and no living soul bound to keep her. She had walked out the far side of a single winter, with water standing in dry ground. Her own name inked into the county's records by her own hand. A table gone full at supper. The uncle who had once weighed her out just barely enough to call it kindness was given back more than he had thrown away. The great uncle the army had buried on paper, so that a swindler could not follow him, had reached up out of the ground, and caught her the very season her own blood let her fall. None of it had been handed to her. Every last board and coin and acre of it had been stayed for. We tell these stories because the country is still full of ground folks have looked at once, and called worthless. Just as full of people who have been looked at the very same way. The truest inheritance in this whole tale was never the gold in the wooden box. It was the patience to see what is still sound inside a broken thing. The plain stubbornness to stay long enough to prove it. Sometimes the ones who love you most are the ones you never got to thank. Sometimes the roof over your head was raised by hands you will never shake. Sometimes the family that keeps you is not the family you were given. It is the family you build. Board by board, stone by stone, loaf of bread by loaf of bread, across the seasons of a life. If Ada's story warmed something in you tonight, carry one question out with you before you go. Somewhere in your house there is a small worn object. You have hauled it through every move and every hard season, kept not for its worth, but for the hand that once gave it to you. Tell us in the comments what that object is, whose hand you can still feel on it, where you are watching from tonight, and who, in the long story of your own life, once built you a place to stand, before you even knew you would need it.